Welcome back to the Essential GovCon Brief, Gordon Reese's monthly government contracts podcast. I'm Patrick Burns, and joining me this month is my colleague, Quyen Dang. Quinn, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Patrick. Happy to be back.
So we have four developments from July to cover today. We'll start with the major change in the CMMC rollout. Then we'll discuss a $7.75 million False Claims Act settlement involving an organizational conflict of interest. We'll also discuss a new executive order targeting defense supply chains. And finally, a significant increase in the TINA threshold for certain defense contracts. So let's start with CMMC because this was a pretty significant change in direction from the DOW. On July 13th, the DOW announced that it was immediately suspending phase 2 of the Cybersecurity Model Certification Program. So phase 2 had been scheduled to take effect on November 10th of this year and would have been significantly expanded the use of CMMC Level 2 third-party assessments in applicable solicitations and contracts. Instead, the department has suspended the transition to phase 2 along with pending and future phase 2 implementation milestones.
Yeah, and that's an important distinction. CMMC itself isn't going away. Phase 1 is still in effect, including the self-assessment requirements. What the department is really doing here is taking another look at how the next phase should work. It created a CMMC reform task force with 60 days to review the program and recommend changes. In the meantime, the department says it will keep enforcing cybersecurity requirements through self-assessments and select government-led assessments.
And one of the major reasons for the review appears to be the cost administrative burden of the existing framework. DOW has specifically identified concerns about the impact on small and medium-sized businesses and as well as non-traditional defense contractors. So the stated goal is to put greater emphasis on cybersecurity while at the same time reducing the administrative burdens associated with the certification process.
Yeah, and along those lines, the department is also asking the industry to weigh in. It issued a request for information asking about real world costs and administrative burdens of CMMC, commercial cybersecurity capabilities, self attesting, and possible regulatory changes.
The key point here for contractors, though, is that a pause in phase 2 is certainly not a pause in any kind of underlying cybersecurity obligations. Defense contractors and subcontractors still remain responsible for safeguarding covered defense information under DFARS. So companies that have been preparing for CMMC shouldn't treat this announcement as a reason to modify their cybersecurity compliance efforts.
Right. So, what may change is how contractors have to demonstrate compliance, but not the underlying expectation that they protect sensitive information. The task force is expected to wrap up its review around mid September. So, we'll be watching closely to see what comes out of that. Our second topic is a False Claims Act settlement that's a good example of how a conflict issue can turn into a much bigger compliance problem. So on July 28th, the DOJ announced that Sierra Nevada Company, or SNC, agreed to pay $7.75 million to resolve FCA allegations tied to its employment of a government official.
And the underlying facts in this case are a bit unusual. So, according to the DOJ, SNC retained Michael Henry, an employee of the Department of War's Joint Staff, as a consultant from 2019 through 2020, while Henry was still working for the government.
Right. And of course, during that period, Henry was still involved on the government side with three contracting vehicles involving SNC. There was an Army subcontract, a GSA IDIQ contract, and then some task orders under a Special Operations Command IDIQ. The DOJ says that after he became an SNC consultant, he kept participating in those contracts on the government side, including evaluating and obtaining approvals for SNC products.
And at the same time, the DOJ alleged that Henry was participating on SNC's side by recommending SNC products for government purchase. So the government's theory was essentially that his simultaneous roles created an organizational conflict of interest under the FAR.
Yeah, that's where the False Claims Act angle comes in. So the DOJ alleged that SNC made or caused material false statements, certifications, and omissions about the absence of an OCI. According to the government, those representations helped induce the contract awards and ultimately led to false claims and statements tied to the contracts. It's worth noting that Henry also pleaded guilty in 2025 to a criminal charge involving acts affecting a personal financial interest.
Something that's particularly noteworthy for contractors here is that we typically think about OCIs in terms of procurement remedies and unidentified or unmitigated conflict might result in a disqualification from procurement, loss of an award, or a successful bid protest. But the settlement shows that this can go much further than that, and the potential consequences can be pretty devastating to a contractor.
Exactly. If the government is relying on a contractor's representation that there isn't a conflict, failing to disclose one can create FCA risk on top of the usual procurement consequences. That means the conflict checking process needs to cover more than employees. We're talking consultants and current or former government personnel need to be part of that too.
And contractors should certainly identify and evaluate these relationships early and make any required disclosures before the issue affects an award or contract performance. So, as always with an FCA settlement, it's important to note that the settlement resolves the allegations only. There was no determination here of actual civil liability against SNC. All right. So our third development could ultimately impose significant new compliance obligations throughout the defense industrial base. On July 20th, President Trump issued Executive Order 14415, which is titled Securing America's Defense Supply Chains and Ensuring Domestic Acquisition of Critical Materials. At a high level, the order directs the Department of War to strengthen domestic and allied sourcing and increase visibility in defense contractor supply chains.
Right. And the level of visibility the order is contemplating is pretty striking. So within 180 days, the Department of War is supposed to develop policy and implementation guidance requiring prime contractors and subcontractors at any tier to map critical supply chains for national security related acquisitions, all the way from raw materials to the end product delivered to the department.
And the contemplated implementing regulations would require contractors to submit a complete bill of materials. What that means is that tracing components, parts, equipment, software, materials back to the origin of the raw materials. And contractors would also have to establish procedures for vetting suppliers and subcontractors for financial risks, foreign ownership control or influence, and as well as manufacturing and supply risks.
And the order also contemplates some pretty specific reporting deadlines. Under the future regulations, contractors would have 15 days after completing the required vetting to notify the Department of War about significant supply chain risks. Then, within 45 days, they'd have to submit a written corrective action plan laying out the mitigation steps and timeline.
The executive order also addresses contractors that rely on materials or components from designated quote unquote unreliable foreign suppliers. So the DOW is directed to require those contractors to qualify and use alternative sources when they're available. And the failure to qualify an alternative source could be considered when the government decides whether to suspend or terminate task orders, declines to exercise options, or terminate an existing contract.
Yeah, and there's also an important change on waivers under 10 USC section 4872. So starting January 1st, 2027, waivers under subsection C1 of that statute generally will require an accepted mitigation plan. Waivers under subsection E are also being restricted, although the order preserves another path involving a request to the National Security Advisor. For the mitigation plan route, the contractor would have to identify the non-compliant source, document efforts to find compliant material, explain how it will remove the non-compliant material from the supply chain, and give the government a timeline for that.
So important point here that many of these requirements aren't effective yet. So the supply chain mapping, bill of materials, supplier vetting obligations depend on implementing guidance and regulations that still need to be issued. An executive order doesn't impose an immediate across the board domestic content requirement.
Yeah, and even with the implementing rules still to come, the direction is pretty clear. Contractors should expect the Department of War to want much more visibility into where materials and components come from, including who owns or controls suppliers and where the weak points are in the supply chain, even several tiers down.
So even though regulations aren't here yet, contractors supporting national security acquisitions should seriously consider what visibility they currently have in their lower tier supply chains and whether their existing systems could provide the level of traceability that's contemplated by the executive order.
Our last topic is a major change to the certified cost or pricing data rules for defense contractors. Effective July 1st, the threshold for certain defense procurements under the Truthful Cost or Pricing Data Statute, still commonly called TINA, jumped from the inflation adjusted $2.5 million level to $10 million.
And that's quite a substantial increase. This change comes from Section 1804 of the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act. And so for covered DOW prime contracts, entered into after June 30th, offerors generally aren't required to submit certified cost or pricing data unless the expected contract price exceeds 10 million, assuming no statutory exception applies.
Yeah, and this $10 million figure also applies to covered prime contract modifications and to certain subcontracts, but the subcontract rules have an important date line. For subcontracts under prime contracts entered into after June 30th of this year, the threshold is $10 million. Subcontracts under older primes stay under the prior applicable threshold, and subcontract modifications are a separate category. So, this is an area where contractors really need to check the specific action.
And there's another important limitation. This isn't a government wide increase. The $10 million threshold we're discussing applies to cover defense procurements. Contractors shouldn't assume that every federal procurement is now subject to the same threshold.
Yeah, and practically speaking, that should mean fewer defense procurements where contractors have to submit certified cost or pricing data. And with fewer transactions in that category, there should also be less defective pricing exposure for actions that now fall below the threshold.
Falling below that $10 million threshold doesn't necessarily mean a contractor can simply decline to provide pricing information. Contracting officers still have to determine proposed prices are fair and reasonable. And so, when necessary, they can request data other than certified cost or pricing data to make that determination.
Yeah, but there is one implementation wrinkle. The codified FAR still shows $2.5 million, but the Department of War has implemented a new defense threshold under its Part 215 class deviation. So contractors shouldn't look at the FAR number in isolation.
So, at least during this transition period, contractors should pay close attention to their particular procurement, the date of the underlying contract, and the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements when determining whether certified cost or pricing data is required. All right, so that's our update for this month. July gave defense contractors quite a bit to digest, from the CMMC Phase 2 suspension and potential reforms to new supply chain initiatives and a major change to TINA.
And a couple of these are very much still moving targets. The CMMC review is underway, and a lot of the supply chain requirements under Executive Order 14415 won't be concrete until the Department of War issues its implementing guidance and regulations.
Which means we'll almost certainly be revisiting some of these issues in future episodes. Quinn, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Patrick. Always good to be here.
And thanks to everyone for listening to episode 25 of the Essential GovCon Brief. You can find our latest government contracts legal update and any additional insights from Gordon Reese's Government Contracts Practice Group online. So we will see you next month.